Queens Highway, so it goes completely around the perimeter of the island. And for our study, there are actually sort of 6 official cemeteries on the island, but we've focused on 5. We sort of excluded the Coburn Catholic Cemetery because we want municipal cemeteries. And so these are associated with 5 of the settlements, and the first is North Victoria Hill, and the next is United Estates, and then we have Sugarloaf, Coburn Town, and Farquharson's. Okay, go to the next slide. Okay, so these are not the only sites that people have obviously been buried on the island. So a little bit about burial practices. We know that early on people were not using cemeteries, and that a lot of times people were buried in sort of unmarked plots, and that it was likely that slaves were buried on plantation lands, and it was a considerable amount of time before we find sort of our official cemeteries that we have today. And this is just a little bit more. We have a couple places that local residents say people are buried that aren't necessarily in use anymore, and these aren't places that are sort of officially recognized, so we didn't really use them in our study. So our 5 cemeteries that we've studied, the historical record shows that sort of the first time they were sort of reported by the British Island Commissioner was in the 1890s, although these were sort of described as, cemeteries that had already been in use and were already sort of, ongoing spaces. So we're assuming that they've been used sort of, even decades earlier. And then finally, in terms of how these spaces are continuing to be used, 2 of the cemeteries are no longer kind of actively being used by the community, although they are in some ways sort of maintained. So Farquharson Cemetery is no longer in use, and we haven't seen any modern graves in North Victoria Hill. However, Coburn Town and the other cemeteries are still sort of very active. Okay, so just a little bit about our methods and how we collected this data. We visited every cemetery, and we sort of did a survey of the spaces. We collected data on different types of grave types, inscriptions, assembled maps of each of these spaces. And so I'm just going to introduce to you some of the more common grave types that we encountered in some of these cemeteries on the island. And so the first one is modern grave markers. We've just called them modern grave markers. And these might be sort of familiar looking graves. They're present in a lot of the cemeteries on New Providence. But for the most part, these have only been used starting in the 1970s to the present. And just sort of to harken back to the history, we know that these cemeteries have at least 120 years of history on the island. So that's sort of 90 years, unaccounted for. That was a big time in history and changes in Bahamian culture. So many of the other grave markers sort of express a very different identity than that of New Providence and other islands. One of the popular grave marker types was the lignum vitae. And so a tree was just sort of simply planted in the, to mark a plot, and then it was sort of grew and was maintained over years. And you can see in several of the cemeteries that there will be rows and rows of different lignum vitae trees. Another popular grave marker type was the rock circle with plant. Pretty self-explanatory, but typically you would just have a circle of rocks that would surround often some kind of flowering plant. And while these are likely not grave markers that are consistently being produced now, they're certainly grave markers that are being maintained on the island. So people are continuing to sort of make sure that these plots are maintained. A headstone with a footstone, just sort of 2 simple limestone slabs that are unmodified, that were just sort of simply used to kind of mark the just sort of the plot space. And these are sort of in a way attempting to replicate some European styles of graves, but at the same time, like I stated, there were no inscriptions, so it's a little bit of a different idea. And then I believe this is the last one that we're going to talk about, but these are rock piles, and these, in addition to sort of being symbolic sort of grave markers, can also be sort of the product of function that in constructing sort of a plot, the contents of the hole that was dug would have just been placed on top to mark where the person was. So what's your next one? And sarcophagus, okay. This is a grave marker type that is most common to Coburn Town Cemetery. And you can see some of these in New Providence as well, but these have mostly originated in practices in England and the United States during the 18th and 19th centuries. And so they're sort of simply often rock piles that are sort of encased in like a concrete, just to sort of give that kind of elongated sarcophagus sort of shape. Okay, a little bit just about kind of site formation and sort of the landscape of these spaces is that it becomes difficult oftentimes for archaeologists to map these spaces and to know where exactly people are buried. In certain cases, I mean, weather, hurricanes can move graves around, soil can be unstable, and graves marked as vegetation can sort of be problematic because you don't know necessarily whether something is a grave, whether something is just a plant. So sometimes it can be difficult to sort of really be able to understand the complete layout of a cemetery space. Okay, I'm just going to give you, before we go into individual cemeteries, I'm just going to give, you know, some kind of an overview, just sort of general overview on some of the things that are on there. So once again, there are 6 cemeteries, but we're going to focus on the 5. Catholic cemetery is not going to be included. And again, 2 cemeteries no longer active, and then the 3 United States Sugarloaf and Coburn Town are still very much active in these cemeteries. Can everybody see, I sort of feebly tried to locate a little bit of a shallow ridge among the green on that picture. Can everybody see that?
Say the arrow.
The arrow, yes, all right. Well, this is sort of an example of cemetery expansion. And so these are some of the things that we look for as archaeologists. That we see how this space is being used, that there are older graves in one part of the cemetery and they sort of slowly become new, and we see that at some point it was sort of significant enough that wall had to be knocked down and sort of the cemetery had to be expanded. So this is present in some of these cemeteries. Next slide. While all 5 cemeteries are sort of kind of a marked or sort of delineated space that they're surrounded by walls, the access of the cemeteries and the sort of physical relationship that they have with towns is sort of different, that they could either be within the town itself or right next to it or even a bit of a distance away. And dating these grave markers becomes somewhat problematic. In like cemeteries on New Providence or in Nassau, it's very easy to date graves because we have the years right on the gravestones, but inscriptions aren't as common on San Salvador, so it becomes a little bit more difficult to date when people are buried. We have to use some, alternative methods of guesswork. But this next slide is going to be a graph that just sort of shows you the percentages of inscribed graves versus non-inscribed graves. And this is actually kind of cool and kind of important because it shows that while we had residents living in all these settlements that were literate, there were active choices that people were making to not inscribe graves. And that those choices were sort of different depending on what settlement people are coming from.